Hey girls, I was going to talk to you about the book of James. I was just rereading it and thinking about some of the things that I need to keep in mind about the book. And so I came up with 5 things, so I'll just share those with you. I think the first thing is that we have to read the book of James in light of the rest of the Bible. Martin Luther didn't like it. He wanted it out of the canon because he just read Galatians, all about Christ's sufficiency, anti-works righteousness. And so the book of James just threw him for a loop. And I think if we read it without remembering the gospel, we can fall into that works righteousness trap. And instead, I think we should read James as just a list of ways we can respond in worship to what Christ has already done. So that's the first thing I have to remember when I read James, is that Christ is the only one sufficient for my salvation. And when I act rightly, it's through His power, it's by His grace, and it doesn't earn me anything, but it's a way I can just worship God. So that's the first thing I think of. And the second is kind of personal. It is very personal to me, and it's the theme of steadfastness in James. He mentions it at least 3 different times. Let me just briefly remind you. In chapter 1, 2-4, he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet various trials, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." And then 1:12 says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." And then in chapter 5, he says the same thing, but he mentions a Bible character that we're familiar with. He says, "Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." And I think, if you've read the book of Job, this verse is weird. Just to think about the fact that James' takeaway is that God is merciful. You read about Job just losing everything. I mean, just such catastrophic loss that none of us can really fathom, even in our own pain. And if you know my personal situation, I've experienced quite a bit of loss recently. But it still doesn't compare to what Job went through. And so for James to say that he was, that this is a story about God's compassion, we really have to think about that. And I think the takeaway from James is in chapter 1, 16 and 17, he says, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of His own will He brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of His creatures." What I take away from that is that steadfastness requires suffering. And so when we say, "Lord, make me more steadfast," that's going to mean suffering. But the promise is, it's a God who gives perfect gifts, who brings that suffering, and He's consistent. I think one of the scariest things about any relationship is the element of surprise, or the fact that the person could change at any moment. Something you say could make them angry, or they might leave you, or something is going to change in your relationship, and you can't predict it. And again, speaking from personal experience here, it's just unpredictability is scary. But this passage in James says that there's no variation or shadow due to change. God does not change. And so if He's the one helping us become steadfast, if He's the one overseeing these trials in our life, we can trust Him. We can't trust anyone else to that extent, but we can trust God. And so I would encourage you to keep asking God for steadfastness, and don't be scared about what that looks like, because it's worth it. And believe me, that I'm saying that from personal experience. So that's number 2. I think number 3 is just thinking about all that James says about the tongue. And I just have a short point here. It's, don't underestimate the power of your own tongue, both for good and for evil. Learn how to harness the power of your words. And, some of you guys probably are runners, or you do races or marathons, and I don't understand you. But, you work out and you prepare and you train. And that's what we have to do with our tongues. The next time you have this great story that will just really delight a friend if you share it, but will hurt another friend, slander them, exercise that muscle of self-control by not sharing the story. Don't respond to that stupid guy on Facebook on that thread where there's an argument going on. Restrain that muscle for the sake of holiness, and practice restraint with your tongue. I think that is so hard for me. I love talking, and I speak before I think, and I can't use that as an excuse. I need to train for this race, in the sense of restraining my tongue, and also exercising it by using it rightly, using it to build up, using my words to edify. I love to write, and sometimes I write things, and I ask myself, what is this for? Is this just for me because I want people to know this about me? Or is this because I want to point to Christ? And obviously we say a lot of things, and they're not all the gospel, but I think we need to be examining our words, especially, when we're just casually conversing with our friends. That's when things just slip out, and that's when we make big mistakes. So I would just say that I'm reminded to harness my tongue as a tool for the kingdom. And then number 4 is about partiality. James talks about partiality in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And my only comment on that is, I think we all have a different least of these. I do not think that we all have the same group of people that we struggle to love. I know that we don't, because I know some people who struggle to love homeless people, but that's not my least of these. I mean, I need to love and serve them, but they're pretty easy for me to love. I have a harder time loving legalists. That's just my personal struggle, probably because I am a legalist half the time. But when it comes to partiality, we need to make sure we're not just pursuing someone else's least of these, but that we're pursuing the group that we show partiality to, the group that we judge, the kind of person that just, when they walk into the room, you just want to leave, or you want to shun. So, ask yourself, who are the hardest people for you to love? You don't have to say it out loud. Be honest, and then make sure you're not giving yourself a free pass just because that group might get attention from other people, because we all have a different least of these. And then the last thing, I love chapter 4, verse 2 says, I don't love this part, but he says, you desire and you do not have. And then verse 6 says, but he gives more grace. So we desire, we're discontent, we're Israel, but he gives more grace. And I think the number one problem for young women, or for any women, is contentment. We always want something. Right now, if I asked you, every single one of you could tell me one thing that you want that you don't have. I've got a long list. But I was just reading in Colossians 3 that Paul says that covetousness, wanting something that someone else has or that you don't have, whether it be you wish that you had their body, which, okay, every woman, yeah, we all look at other girls and say, oh my gosh, I wish that my skin was like hers, or I wish that I had, her legs, or whatever. Or if you want what they have, you want their relationship that seems so perfect, or you want their talent in fill in the blank. Paul says that covetousness is idolatry. And so I think we need to treat our, we desire and we do not have, we need to treat that as such.